Hello, strangers. It is my honor to wish a very happy anniversary to my good friend, the Darkness Diaries. But I also bring a gift. Story number 112. My parents are both police. As you can imagine, the bedtime stories in our house were a little different, a little realer, a little grittier, as an occasional detail would slip out, indicating the story was not entirely fictitious. They used phrases I didn't hear anywhere else. Outrunning a cop, but never his radio. Full moon, prepare for loons. The long arm of the law. 3 hots and a cot. My teachers must have had to stifle laughter when reading my free write assignments at school for how many of these slipped into my own vernacular. But beyond that, both Mom and Dad told great stories. As a child, I looked forward to them more than Saturday morning cartoons. The stories differed, but then again, they were the same: protection and service. No abandoned princesses or lost boys in their stories. At least not for long. There was always something bigger, stronger, that would come and would save them. It wasn't something I noticed until much later, but it does play a large role in this story. We grew up normal in all other respects, right down to birthday parties. I'd invited some girls from my school. I didn't know them so well, but I wanted to be friends. And inviting them to my house for a movie and cake. I mean, that should be surefire, right? I was turning 11, and one of the presents my mom got me was a stuffed animal, a dog with floppy ears and shiny black eyes, and a big dopey grin. He was gingery in color, with blunt, tan paws and underbelly. I looked at him and loved him from the first. During the unwrapping, my guests were kind, oohing and awing appreciatively. But when we got to the movie, one of them, Deborah, sidled up to me with her sister. They started whisper talking about how embarrassing it was to get such a childish toy for my birthday, and it must be because I was such a baby. How cheap the decorations were. Had my parents not cared to buy better food than the obvious store generics? How the kids at school would react if they knew. My mom happened in then, bringing more popcorn and asking if we were having a good time. Then Deborah clapped a hand on my shoulder, hard, and said in a voice like she was announcing something above a crowd, how she'd be sure to let all the kids know exactly how much fun my birthday party was. And all those great presents, of course. My mom beamed. I was stunned. I didn't know what to do. It hadn't even occurred to me that anything was off or wrong. My mom and dad had paid a lot of money for an ice cream cake, the fancy Viennetta from the commercials that played at night between shows my parents watched. Dessert itself was a luxury in our house, but listening to these girls, it went from the sophisticated treat I'd thought it was to something tacky and shameful. But if my mom knew they were making fun of it, of all of it, she'd be crushed. I couldn't tell her. I just kept my eyes trained on the movie and watched the characters blur as tears collected on the rims of my eyes. School became hell. It seemed like everybody had heard before I even slid into my desk that Monday morning. They doled it out in bits and pieces, half true, half completely made up, all about my home, my room, everything about me. Not all at once. I'd hear something, or some other kid would come up, a small crowd of the others watching, and loudly ask if it was true if. There was no winning. If I protested, it looked like I was doing too much, and it must be true. If I said no and tried my best not to cry, they'd say that meant it was true, or else I'd say otherwise. Wouldn't be so bothered if it was a lie. And when I'd cry, well, that's when I'd be called a baby, and also that meant it was true. I didn't tell anyone about what was going on at school. I shrank into myself, but after school I'd come home, and there was my relief. I put the mean kids into a box in my head. I firmly taped it shut, and I'd throw myself into enjoying my parents, doing my chores, just thinking of anything else. The stories at bedtime, though, were both something that I craved desperately, and unfortunately were bittersweet. Stories meant bedtime, and bedtime meant fighting sleep. The sooner I slept, the sooner I'd have to wake up, and it would be a new day of hell at school. I'd curl up with my stuffed dog and lay awake as long as I could, trying hard to fight my heavy eyelids by staring at the dog's face. His name was the dog, because I hadn't given him a proper name yet. I had just had too much on my mind to do so. Each night, though, I memorized his goofy, happy expression, anxiously wanting some of his happiness for myself. And then came the night that things changed. It was the last week of school. I was looking at his big plastic eyes right as a big old tear plopped onto them. I was crying again. I'd stopped noticing, and for a moment, I felt the same shame. I was a baby, taking comfort in baby things like stuffed animals, just like they said. But it was only for a moment. Something in that moment snapped. It was the casual, carefree face of the dog toy itself, looking back at me. It seemed to grow, or intensify somehow, and the thought lanced through my head in a voice that didn't quite sound like mine. Look at me. Do I look bothered? No. Nothing they say or do is important enough for me to stop smiling, because they aren't important. Without thinking, I asked back, "They're not?" "No, you are." That gave me pause, but the voice continued. "What am I?" A dog?" We were dog people, and the dogs were always heroes in my parents' stories. They were always saving kids from burning buildings, appearing out of nowhere to chase intruders from homes. I looked at his face again, and that dopey grin seemed to widen. "That's right. I am a dog. I will protect you." The next day of school. Oh, some kid still made fun of me for not even having to wear a training bra yet. Such a baby. I steadied myself. I waited for that horrible hot pressure in my face to signal a blush, the coming tears. And I remembered my stuffed dog. Like cold water on a flame, the embarrassment went away. I looked back at the kid, and I asked him why he was so curious about girls' underwear. It was his turn to turn bright red, and I heard a gasp and whispering from the little group of kids who'd gathered to watch my reaction. The boy stammered that he wasn't asking, he was told to ask. To which that same calm voice that didn't sound like my voice came from me and said, "And what pervo would be asking about it?" Another scoff, some giggles from the crowd. My eyes shifted to them, and the deadness, the still calm that I felt inside, seemed to reflect their nastiness back to them. I watched their faces pinch, grow red and hot, as they all stuttered about how no, they weren't pervs, they weren't the one, all but one face. Deborah's, in the middle of the throng. She was red, but not ashamed red. She was angry red, wrathfully red. This stopped the bullying at school that day, and the next. The final day of the school year, even a couple of kids were cool with me again. They let me play tetherball with them instead of telling me it wasn't for babies like they had for weeks before. But as I walked home from school that day, my lunchbox banging against my legs, I got the sense that something was wrong. I stopped turned my head, and I immediately regretted it. Here came Deborah, her sister, and a couple of the other mean girls that they palled around with. This wasn't the way they walked home. I knew because I'd walked this way for years. I'd never seen them. But nonetheless, here they came. I heard Deborah's voice, something about, "Call me a pervo, huh? Why don't you come back and say that now?" Her friends erupted in giggles beside her, laughing, their voices high-pitched, cutting, cruel, and loud, getting louder, because they were gaining on me. The cool calm that I felt before, MIA. I ran. It was the same way I went home every day, but in my panic I began making turns, running down streets I'd passed before. Each row of houses looked alien, strange for the angle of them I'd never seen. Behind me, I heard footsteps, jeering. I couldn't make out what they said, but the tone told me enough. It was mean, and once they caught up with me, it'd grow into something worse. But they'd have to catch me, and I was faster. After a few streets, I was leaving them at least a block behind. I darted down another street I'd never gone down before, and took a breath. I'd lost them, but I'd also lost myself. Nothing looked familiar. I wheeled behind a parked van. I got down on my hands and knees and scuttled under it, even as my imagination told me the van would rumble to life and run me over. For a moment, my shoulders jerked back, and I panicked again, squealing. But then I realized it was my backpack. I shucked it, flattened myself on the pavement, and squirmed under the van, dragging it behind me. Then, I waited. I had no watch, no way to tell time, but I resolved to stay under that van until I was certain they'd given up. But they hadn't given up. As fast as I was, they managed to see what street I'd turned down. They had to have, because it wasn't long before I heard their footsteps. They were slowed, and the tone of their voices, while panting from the unplanned sprint, was still high-pitched, sharp, catty. Lots of, come out, wherever you are," and "Marco," followed by mocking laughter. I had my head turned in the direction I'd come, down the street, and I could now see their airwalks and vans coming my way, slapping the ground. I tried to hold my breath, but my heart was hammering in my chest. As they got closer, I was dead certain they'd spy the bright yellow of my backpack. Hell, smell the sweaty fear on me. I began wishing the van would come to life and end me before they could. And a rumble sounded, but not from the van. I chanced it, turning my head to the other side of the van. From behind a car parked a bit further down the road, I saw a leg, a thick, gingery furred leg on a massive paw the size of one of my dad's oven mitts. Then another. The paws ended in brutish claws, broken flat and jagged. The first two were joined by another pair as the thing, a bear, a wolf, the thing was massive, emerged onto the street. The rumble was coming from it. It was growling, and as I listened, the growl tuned up, louder and louder, until it finally smothered the giggly, chanting sound of Deborah and her friends. I heard the gasp. I felt my body begin to shake. The gasp was coming from right behind me. I slowly turned my head back. I saw 5 pairs of girls' shoes on the sidewalk right beside the van I hid under. They were close enough that the wild thought inspired by children's TV shows appeared. Tie their shoelaces together. I heard wild laughter, and I realized it was my laughter coming from me, but also coming from the street where I'd seen the wolf-bear legs lurk out. I turned my head, and I saw the thing had moved, was now close, close to the van, the shadow of it falling over my hand. From above the little bar of light between the bottom of the van and the road, my little window into the world out from under this van, I saw one of its front legs lift and then stretch. It stretched impossibly long, the blunted claws growing out, becoming talons. No, tusks. Even talons weren't so thick. That did it. I scamper crawled out from under the van, not in the direction of either side. Sidewalk, Deborah and her friends. Street side, the creature I'd decided was a lion, a mountain lion like the news said came into neighborhoods sometimes. No. I went out the back of the van, not caring how my knees got road rashed as I scurried out, dragging my backpack in a grip I didn't have the conscious thought to release. I emerged from the back of the van and turned around, only to see that the lion must have moved again to the front of the van. At least, that's where Deborah and the other girls were staring now. If I'd been afraid they'd see me, that fear would have been meaningless. The long front leg of the thing now grew from the front of the van. It was impossibly jointed, and now I could just see a muzzle flashing open, wicked and wide, and exposing double, no, triple rows of sharp teeth. Fuck. Like my mind was replaying slow-mo, I saw Deborah throw her thermos in the direction of the muzzle. It hit, and a low screeching sound came, but the front leg didn't stop. No. It reared back just a bit, then came whipping through the air and latched onto Deborah's arm, still extended from that throw. And it pulled. Deborah was flying off her feet, pulled towards that gaping mouth. And again, I was off, running for my life. The screams behind me kept me from looking back even once. I made it home before Mom or Dad. Thank God. I was a mess, and they would have asked. And what would I have told them? Thankfully, the last few months had taught me how to keep my mouth shut around them. I cleaned up as best I could. The shirt I'd worn was a complete loss. I'd rubbed holes in it, and even with scrubbing, I couldn't get the road grime off of them. I instead hid it in the bottom of my backpack. My heartbeat had almost got back to normal by the time someone, my dad, it was Mom's turn on duty, came home. I was in my room, rereading the same sentence in my book as I heard his feet come down the hall. He was carrying something from how heavy his feet sounded. He opened my door and paused before telling me that something had happened. I held my breath. They were cops. Surely they would have heard about the mountain lion. Was he going to ask if I knew the girls it had attacked? Could I keep a straight face? But no. He told me, with regret in his voice, that while doing the laundry that day, he'd stripped my bed. He must have bundled my stuffed dog into the sheets, and it had gotten caught in the washing machine. As he held it out to me, I saw that its right front leg had been stretched, the stitches near popped, the paw dangling much lower than the others. I took it from his hands and looked into that dopey smile and noted that one of the eyes had a gash through its paint. It gave it a ghostly white look like cataracts, like something had hit it in the eye, something hard, like a thermos. My dad offered to buy me a new one. The surprise on my dad's face when I clamped my arms around it and told him never. This was mine and I loved him even more. It made me laugh. He told me he wasn't aware I was so attached and was glad they'd picked that one out for my birthday, then asked if I had finally named him. And I told him I had, or rather, he and Mom had, because standing there, examining the stretched out front leg, now cottony and plush, no claws in sight because I was his girl and he was my dog. I remembered one of those little phrases my parents absently peppered into their stories. Stories about good guys and bad guys, about fear and about protection, saving people. I have no doubt now that that theme of protecting came from my parents hoping that I would be proud of them for what they did as police, hoping to allay my fears as I grew into a sometimes scary world, and assuring me that no matter what, justice would always win, because no one can get away from the long arm au-delà. I still have my dog to this day. He's worn, one of his ears has gone to rags from another story, but I am his girl and he is my dog. My dog named au-delà.